listening to the Decarbonisation Dialogue, a podcast from Salix.
Welcome to Delivering on Climate Change, our collective challenge. Welcome to the Decarbonisation Dialogue. I am Hannah Walker, and I believe that the best way to communicate a message is to be passionate about what you're talking about. And through that passion, I believe you take people with you and create action using your influence to make change and make a difference. Our task today is to get all of us to net zero. My guest today is Professor AbuBakr Bahaj, who is leading the Energy and Climate Change Division and the Sustainable Energy Research Group at the University of Southampton. For more than 30 years, the professor has pioneered sustainable energy research and established the energy theme within the university. We're going to be talking about rising sea levels and what initiatives businesses and all of us can do to implement and combat climate change. AbuBakr is an engineer by training and, as I say, leads the climate division, completed his PhD at the university from researcher to personal chair in sustainable energy. He founded the International Marine Energy Journal, and in 2012 he was appointed Chief Scientific Advisor to Southampton City Council, which was the first, I believe, in the UK. In 2014, the UK Science Council named him as one of the UK's 100 leading practicing scientists. He has also published hundreds of pieces in various scientific magazines. So it's a great honour to have AbuBakr with me today. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Right, let's start, as I always like to do, at the beginning. And could you please tell us a bit about your career and what led your interest in all things climate and rising sea levels, for example? Where does it start? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, it started really on a flight going from the UK back to my original country, Yemen, where I sat next to somebody from the Save the Children Fund who was traveling to Yemen, and he asked me the question, what could UNICEF do? UNICEF, I think it's called Save the Children Fund. What could UNICEF do for people in Yemen, especially isolated villages in Yemen? So I said, give them water. And basically, this is really quite important because not only for drinking, for keeping us healthy, but also for crops and things like that they have. Also for keeping bees and other things that you may want to have. So on a napkin, we designed a project where they can provide water for some villages in Yemen. And I just said to him, then maybe one of the difficulties for getting that sort of technology to be really long-term is have them delivered through solar power rather than diesel generators. You see the linking between, renewables as well as water, health, and also food. So we did manage to get the project on. And on my return to the UK, I looked around the university and there was nothing in the university working around energy. So I created the energy in the university based on that chance of going across to deliver something in Yemen. And basically this is how it started. And as you know, it's directly linked, renewables are directly linked to reducing our fossil fuel emissions. And that's why we have developed the division here to work in that field.
We're looking at huge challenges as we face climate change. And you work and you live near the sea, I think in Southampton. What do rising sea levels mean for coastal areas? And did I read somewhere that will the Isle of Wight, it might have even been something you wrote, but you will correct me, I am sure, but will the Isle of Wight really become 2 or 3 islands rather than one? Let's talk about what's happening to the sea levels locally to you, but also, of course, global sea level rises.
Global sea level rise is really linked up to climate change. Basically, you have glaciers melting, you got a lot of water coming into the sea, and the sea rises. Southampton is really on the level where we need to have either strengthening or basically protection. And my first lecture to my students, I show an image of the Solent region, which shows the effect of climate change from a 1 degree rise to 4 degree rise. And up to 2 degree rise, you can see even the Southampton football ground will be like a swimming pool. Mm-hmm. So rather than play football, you'll be going to St. Mary's to actually swim. So I show that to my students. Actually, they are very much became aware of the linkage between renewables and sea level rises and what we need to do in terms of fossil fuels. So it is important to recognize this link, and it's important to understand how fossil fuels or carbon that we put in the atmosphere is really affecting our seas and making the infrastructure vulnerable for these types of activities that we do as humans. So Southampton has got a very important port, in fact, one of the important ports in the UK, and it will be underwater if the 2 degree sea level rise. Quite a lot of it will be underwater until we defend it. If we don't defend it, then we'll have no port really of any existence. So a lot of livelihood because people work in the ports, a lot of export, which other people in the hinterland in the UK actually rely on. So there's a huge implication economically if you have undermined one of the major ports in the UK. So climate change and sea level rise are really important, not only from the point of view of the environment, but also in terms of economics and livelihoods.
Okay, so I have two questions leading from that. Is the economics, you're right, we're not just talking Southampton Football Club, although that really creates a picture, a good picture there. But obviously there's a lot of hotels, the economy, the businesses all in that area. But what kind of timescale are we talking about? You say a lot of the areas will certainly be underwater, but what are we talking? Are we talking about 2030, 2040? What kind of timescales if we don't address these issues?
I think we're talking about 2050 onwards. The projection now is around 1 degree centigrade rise. And if we don't arrest that by reducing our pumping of CO2 to the environment, then it will deteriorate very quickly. And so we'll be looking at a shorter time frame, if you see what I mean. So it's important that we encourage governments, in spite of the economic situations, to actually stay on the road of delivering on renewables and reducing emissions.
And this isn't a new thing, obviously, because rising sea levels, it's been happening since the 1800s.
Correct.
So this is not a surprise. You mentioned governments, which takes me to the next question, because governments are facing huge issues. There's a lot going on in our world today. You turn on the news, it's catastrophe. We've got geopolitical strife. It's huge issues and big parts of the conversation. How can we get a more integrated approach from our governments? And is this picture that you've created up to government to solve? How are we going to address this?
I think it's not just governments, but I think across the piece, from the personal behavior that we have ourselves, as well to our communities, to our villages, cities, and also the government that we need to have, but also internationally. There is a link. Our impact on international emissions is very, very small. But we need to be at the forefront to influence those people or those countries who are actually emitting a lot, because the Earth is not just limited to England or Britain, it's limited to all of us around the Earth, and the environment and the atmosphere is globally sort of shared between us. All the levels that are needed to be done to allow us to build up a unified approach to how we recognize this as a problem and how our behavior should change. And the behavior change is really important in relation to what we do in our houses, for example. But that requires perhaps installations, so some incentives from the government to do that. Reducing our emissions through reducing our consumption of energy, for example. Using heat pumps rather than using gas boilers, electric vehicles and so forth. But there are consequences to, if you see what I mean. There is consequences even if you go to electric vehicles. Emissions are not really zero from those because you've got the tar emissions and so forth. So it's important to have the link between what we can do between communities as well as government, but also have consequences to decisions being highlighted. For example, if you have a a plan for a major wind farm around a community, which people are very much against because of the visual impact and so forth, we need to communicate the link between that wind farm and also the impact of flooding. And flooding, there is a lot of votes in flooding. You know, if you got cities that are flooded and you don't do anything about flood defenses, you will not be elected next time round. So this interlink between society aspect and living through politics, through economics, are really important to highlight and communicate to communities to allow them to see these linkages. Mm-hmm. At the moment, we're not doing it very well.
So it is this whole combination of factors, and you say we're not doing it very well. And because I was going to say, what cities do you think are doing it well? What, you know, in terms of that sustainable infrastructure, are there any examples? We work a lot, for example, with towns and cities as well, developing heat networks, which is obviously, again, not a new technology, but it's something that is becoming more, something that we are doing more and more of. But so what, in your view, what cities are doing this well?
City of Bristol are, I think, doing quite well. Mm-hmm. I think Edinburgh, Southampton is aspiring to do that, but all cost money, and it's really come to economics. So you mentioned heat networks. Southampton has a geothermally driven, partly driven heat network from a well that was drilled in 1980, 85, I think. And it was drilled as an experimental well. And then the leader of Southampton City Council, somebody called Alan Whitehead, I think he's very famous for that, he said, no, we'd like to keep it, and actually is now delivering heat, augmented by combined heat and power as well to the city. And we're looking very seriously about how this resource underground for us in Southampton, how can we enhance that capacity within the city network through perhaps drilling other wells that will not only supply the city centre, but also other entities like universities and hospitals and businesses and so forth. So it's important to recognise that things like that, sustainable infrastructure, could really work very well and does decarbonisation at scale. For example, if you do a heat network which is driven by geothermal energy, you can reduce the requirement for a refurbishment until you get the economic footing right, because you're utilizing low carbon heat. So you basically say, okay, we'll do a refurbishment when we can afford it, but we need to have a plan for it, rather than having to spend a lot of money now and then you don't get the benefit of it. So there is an issue around a mix and match in relation to economics. And obviously our grid in terms of electricity will be decarbonized, and the pathway to 2030 is well known, actually well recognized around the world. But there's a lot of tension now between economics, politics, as well as delivering that.
Yes. And in terms of that energy, you've obviously got a huge amount of expertise around all of this. And there are some interesting, I know we're working with some very interesting geothermal projects through our work. So but we're also working on the heat networks and huge heat pump projects, etc. But the geothermal is fascinating. You're very kind of embedded, obviously, with your work at Southampton, but presumably you are asked, do you ever get those kind of informal calls from people wanting to develop a geothermal project, or looking at the risks, or asking you, in your experience, how's this going to work and what should we be looking at? Do you get those kind of calls from people across the country, across the world, maybe?
No, not geothermal. I get a lot of calls from people saying we have invented the world's saving device. They're utilizing wave energy or tidal energy or wind energy or solar energy for that matter. And some of them are fundamentally wrong because they are against thermodynamics, to be frank with you, and so forth. So you do get that.
Let's move away from your work at Southampton. And can you tell me a little bit about your climate research work in Africa and the Philippines? Because obviously there's a vast potential of renewable energy in those countries. Can you tell me a little bit about your work there?
So I told you the story about water and renewable energy in Yemen. And this is really a similar sort of a story. There are about 600 million people in East Africa that don't have access to electricity. People really don't imagine it. I know it because I lived it when I grew up. But people don't imagine what it is to wake up and you don't have a button to press to get electricity or charge your mobile phone. And that's really what made us work around that area. We try to get electricity to those communities that don't have it. Obviously, those countries don't have the resources to do it. And really, people who are working in photovoltaic or solar energy were thinking that the developing countries will actually push the button and make it expand too much. But because it failed, the only thing that really saved photovoltaics is having it in our buildings. You got the German program, you got the German program, UK program, other Italian all those programs allow photovoltaic to grow. And the reason for it is that there is no battery storage. You have the solar panels on the roof of your house, and you have the battery storage being your grid. So if you don't have at night, you don't have the grid, you don't have solar, you don't have the sun, for example, you utilize the grid as your storage. So straight away, you shave off about 30% of the cost of the solar system. So when you have it in communities which are isolated, you need to have the storage. So that's basically how it went out, is that we recognize that these communities were required to have not only the power plant, have the storage and the distribution system. And then we actually did in Africa, we linked up with collecting water as well. So the first project I did in 2012 with my team is that we have the solar panels as a water collectors as well. That collected water and the community could sell it. And those communities really thrived from a small amount of energy, and they are really now increasing to a massive community and so forth, with a lot of services that are run by just that spark of a grant to try out. And I remember when I wrote the grant, I said, I would like to provide power to 50 households. I don't know exactly how to provide it. Is it going to be one panel per household or going to be something else? And it was, to me, it was important not to just give electricity, but also create an environment where businesses could grow, smaller businesses could grow. You can have cooling, you could have hairdressing, you could have education by IT and so forth, and you have welding and all those other things. You cannot do it with just 2 solar panels. You need to have the infrastructure, what's called a mini grid, to allow you to deliver that. And this is one of the fulfilling things for my career, is actually seeing how every 2 or 3 months these communities really grow, and you get other people coming, migrating to where electricity is, which is a huge impact in those countries.
And so that work does come from the heart, doesn't it? As you say,
correct.
That is hugely fulfilling in a really different way from all of your other work. It's not cheap, though, is it?
No, it's not. Luckily for me, I had this grant, and I had a lot of social scientists, not only to look at the technology, but look at the impact of the grant, before and after. And we have a control village and an implementation village. So we know the differences between what they do. But more importantly is that as I got the grant, the costs of photovoltaics and battery storage gone down drastically. So I have more money in the kitty to create not only one project, but actually in Kenya itself, we created 3, and Uganda, we created 2. And these became learning entities where now, hundreds of mini grids like that has sprung up in Africa. And it's really quite important. But you've got this issue, you've got population growth, and you've got small interventions. You need to have a very large interventions to cope with the population growth, because you're still maintaining about 600 million with no electricity in spite of these efforts. And that's because of population growth. So we need to have more funding to allow this to grow further.
Presumably, is that also a large part of your work? Does that, in terms of bringing that funding in and talking and showcasing this work? And as you've explained it to me brilliantly, in terms of that amount of power, that renewable power brings not just power, but everything that is needed to sustain a village, everything that is needed to build and create thriving businesses, schools, populations. Is that a large part of your work, trying to bring that funding to those projects today?
Yes, I think as per a lot of time and effort to try and get some, but funding is very, very limited and actually is not going to where it should be, to be frank with you, which is allowing people to thrive. And there is evidence to indicate that if you give energy to those communities, they will stay within their communities rather than try and migrate and come across the Mediterranean. So it's really important to link all that up. Development is really linked up, to having these facilities so that younger people will not cross, and come to boundaries where they really wanted to stay in their homes if they have the opportunities there. Government should open their minds to linkage that this is really what it should do. And they do it in a big way rather than a drip in here. I mean, for us was an experimental project, but the two governments in Uganda and Kenya actually saw them and they picked them up. And there's a big program in Kenya, which we are involved with, to give about 100 mini-grids to work around communities like that.
Mm-hmm. And is that separate from your work at the university?
We have advisory role with the ministry there, but it is funded by the World Bank and is directly as a loan to the Kenyan government. But they're learning from what we're doing. For example, in our mini-grids, we're not just leaving the mini-grids like this. So 2.8 billion people have got no clean cooking. And nobody really thinks about that very, very much. But there is some programs in here. So now we're utilizing our mini-grids to demonstrate clean cookers for communities. And we started that about 2 years ago. And it's very, very successful. It do two things. Allow people to get rid of having to have biomass and health aspect of cooking with air and so forth, but also enhance the input to the mini-grid operator. So you've got people consuming, so you got an income for that, so you can expand your mini-grid and so forth. And then e-mobility, rather than have a petrol bike and things like that, you can have an electric bike. So electricity really provides quite a lot of other opportunities around mobility and also cooking.
When you first started your work on all things energy and then obviously climate change, did you ever imagine that you would be quoting figures like that, and which make and mean so much to the people you're helping out in those countries?
No, I didn't really imagine. As I said to you in the grant application, I was not really sure what effect would that have. I knew what effect that solar water pumping had on those communities in Yemen, because you have these solar panels and a well in the ground, and the sun comes in the morning, and suddenly water comes out from the pump into a tank. Nobody interferes with it. It's basically done by nature, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. And I could see this linkage about how that changed people's life and allow those communities to grow, and try and see how that will work in Africa. But then when you go there, you realize the realities and the obstacles that are in front of you in terms of regulations, in terms of having to develop a community, in terms of education and so forth. And we did a lot of training as we installed these kits. We actually did train people to make sure that we're not there all the time. They're there all the time.
And that's exactly it. We started, my final part of this interview is we started our conversation today, and I said, you at work? And you said, yes, I'm in the office. I'm always here. But are you there too? Do you get to go and see the results of your work and see it in action and see how you've managed to help change those lives?
If I have you here, I would have showed you a camera which is looking at the mini-grid in Kenya, where people started to come in and try and do some cooking and other things around that. So we do monitor those things. We monitor to the level of a cafe, for example, in those areas. So we get the energy consumption of those and try and get as much data as we can so that we can inform the next design of project like this to allow them to make sure that there is plenty of power needed, and also to plan for it when the power becomes very limited. How do you expand the project and so forth? So I've got 3 people working on the project here, and we're still on a very strong conversation on a weekly basis around those and around how we invent more and more ideas for the energy to help people to stay where they are and also to expand their horizons.
Thank you very much for sharing that ambition and that vision, and the energy that you bring to this is so vital to the way we move forward and change lives. So thank you very much to Professor AbuBakr Bahaj today for providing such insight. There can be no doubt that climate change is the biggest challenge of our time. Today, we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions to slow global warming. Today, we must act for tomorrow, adjusting our lifestyles to current and future impacts of climate change. Today, we must use our collective wisdom to deliver on our climate commitments. Today, we work for tomorrow's world. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channels, and please do email with any ideas for guests to podcast@salixfinance.co.uk. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Decarbonisation Dialogue, a podcast from Salix. For more information about our work and to find more content, please visit salixfinance.co.uk/podcasts.